Trump hiked tariffs from 10% to 15%. What is the law Trump used to raise global tariffs? What are the effective tariff rates now? What happens to global trade now? Here's how the tariffs will work.
All right, Trump's personalized top-down leadership with the scant dependence on Congress consensus has run headlong into the Supreme Court. Even as public opinion polls suggest the majority of Americans oppose tariffs, he appears ready to override public opinion, brush aside judicial constraints, and push the outer limits of presidential authority in pursuit of what he deems right. Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX Explained. My name is Vineet Malhotra, and what opinion were we talking about? Well, the ABC News, Washington Post, the Ipsos poll conducted by Ipsos knowledge panel just before the Supreme Court cancelled Trump's earlier global tariffs found widespread disapproval. 62% of Americans don't approve Trump's tariff policy. A paper published by Pew Research Center reveals that by a wide margin, Americans continue to say they disapprove of the Trump administration substantially increasing tariffs. 60% say this, including 39% who say they strongly disapprove. But now the story of America's tariff regime has taken a dramatic turn, one that has reshaped global trade flows, upended negotiated deals, and thrown both businesses and governments into a period of profound uncertainty. The United States Supreme Court has struck down his sweeping reciprocal tariffs, ruling that the president overstepped his constitutional authority by imposing import duties under emergency powers. In a 6-3 decision, the court invalidated tariffs introduced after Trump's so-called Liberation Day in April 2025, when the US slapped a 10% baseline tariff on imports from nearly every trading partner, with even higher duties on select countries. At the heart of the case was Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a law designed to give presidents wide authority during national emergencies. Trump argued that chronic trade deficits and unfair trade practices constituted an emergency serious enough to justify sweeping tariffs without congressional approval. The Supreme Court disagreed. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts anchored the ruling firmly in the US Constitution, which explicitly assigns the power to levy taxes and tariffs to Congress, not the president. Roberts noted that while the law grants several emergency powers, it never mentions tariffs or import duties. And after the US Supreme Court struck down the legal foundation of President Donald Trump's sweeping reciprocal tariff program, the White House moved quickly to reassert control. Within hours of the court's order, the administration announced that the global baseline tariff would be raised from 10% to 15% and the maximum permitted under a little-used provision of US trade law. This marked both a retreat and a reset. A retreat from the now invalid tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and a reset through Section 122 of the Trade Act of the 1974, a statute never before deployed to impose such broad global duties. Let's understand this statute. Section 122 gives the US President a temporary authority to impose tariffs without long investigations or detailed reviews. Specifically, the president may impose a temporary import surcharge of up to 15%. Well, the tariff is meant to help address situations where the US faces a large and serious balance of payments deficit, essentially when the country is importing far more than it exports in a way that hurts its international financial position. Any tariffs under Section 122 can only last up to 150 days unless Congress votes to extend them. No formal investigation or multi-agency process is required. The president only needs to make the determination and publish the tariff order. Trump argues that this keeps the tariffs legally valid while his team explores more permanent trade laws or other ways to continue tariffs. But what are they? First is Section 301, which allows tariffs after investigating unfair trade practices by another country. This takes time and case-by-case work. Section 232 allows tariffs when imports are seen as a threat to national security. Trump used this law before to impose steel and aluminum duties. Now, many American companies are demanding refund of tariffs. Each importer may have to file its own lawsuit to obtain a refund. There is no clear path for a broad class action. Under US trade law, importers have 2 years to file claims. Smaller businesses, which were hit hardest by the tariffs, may ultimately walk away from potential refunds rather than pay thousands of dollars in legal fees. Crucially, these refunds apply only to importers, not exporters. The tariffs were paid by US importers and passed on to American consumers, contributing to higher prices and inflation. Exporters, including those from India, suffered indirectly because their goods became less competitive. There is no mechanism under US law to compensate foreign exporters for those losses or for investments made to absorb the shock of tariffs that are now gone. Three things could change from here on, at least for now. With this flat rate of 15%, most major countries around the world are in a comparatively favorable situation than before Friday's court ruling. India, China, South Korea, Japan, almost all ASEAN, Kazakhstan, Turkey, South Africa, Libya, Brazil, Mexico and Canada are now at a lower rate to be implemented from February 24th onwards. Russia, Australia, the UK, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, most of North and Central Africa, Argentina and Colombia are now at a higher tariff rate than previously. The EU and the Scandinavian nations are at where they were under the earlier differential tariff slapped under the IEEPA. The 15% tariff is devising reactions from the world. Australia's government said it will examine all options after Trump imposed a 15% tariff on Australia as well. Australian Trade Minister Don Farrell said in a statement, "We have consistently advocated against these unjustified tariffs. We are working closely with our embassy in Washington to assess the implications and examine all options." German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has already made a statement saying he would speak with European partners to shape a very clear European position and a joint response to Washington before his visit to the US capital in early March. In fact, there are reports suggesting that France's Trade Minister Nicolas Fourrissier is suggesting that EU could even use trade bazooka to counter these tariffs. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva called on Donald Trump to treat all nations fairly after the US leader imposed a 15% tariff on imports in the wake of unfavorable Supreme Court rulings. "I want to tell the US President Donald Trump that we don't want a new Cold War. We don't want interference in any other country. We want all countries to be treated equally," Lula told reporters in New Delhi. Globally, the ruling has added fresh volatility to already fragile trade dynamics. In Washington, officials have acknowledged that the court's decision weakens America's negotiating hand. US businesses are preparing legal claims seeking refunds for tariffs already paid. Markets have reacted cautiously, factoring in policy instability rather than relief. In circumstances such as these, where does the India-US trade deal stand? India and the United States have decided to postpone the planned meeting of their chief trade negotiators in Washington to finalize the text of an interim trade agreement. The Indian delegation had been scheduled to begin a 3-day round of talks on the 23rd of February. China, meanwhile, is watching closely. Analysts say the ruling gives Beijing a moral boost, but not necessarily as failed, but because the legal ground beneath them shifted. With Washington operating on temporary fixes and stopgap arrangements, certainty, not access, has become a scarce commodity. As the US Supreme Court delivers a major check on executive power by striking down President Trump's sweeping reciprocal tariffs under IEEPA, India finds itself in a relatively advantageous spot for now. New Delhi now has a brief window to renegotiate from strength, seeking exemptions, deeper cuts, or safeguards. But extended uncertainty could still disrupt export flows, the broader strategic ties. In this fast-evolving trade saga, strategic patience will be key for India to safeguard its interest amidst Washington's stopgap measures.
Trump hiked tariffs from 10% to 15%. What is the law Trump used to raise global tariffs? What are the effective tariff rates now? What happens to global trade now? Here's how the tariffs will work.